kicking off this next session where I will be joined by Michele Morelli, who is the Senior Vice President of Brand Strategy and Marketing at Toluna. And together, the two of us are going to co-present a piece of research that we have jointly created and share some of the highlights from there. So thanks so much for taking the time to chat today. Why don't you go ahead and give a little intro to yourself and provide some background on Toluna, and I'm going to pull that presentation up while you are speaking.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Michele Morelli, as Scott mentioned, and I am the SVP of Brand Strategy and Marketing at Toluna. For those that don't know Toluna is a technology company that provides market research. And we do this for global brands, top 200, big and small. And a lot of our brands use our technology for qualitative or quantitative insights. And a lot of what we're going to be doing today is talking about some of the research that we did at Toluna around something that we called the coronavirus barometer. Toluna is part of a larger organization. We happen to have something called Harris Interactive in Europe, Kurun Data, which specializes in China. And once the corona pandemic hit, probably around February, we start tracking trends, consumer sentiment, behavior, because everything has been completely upended. So a lot of the insights that you see, we pull from this bi-weekly research that we're doing. And we partnered with PSFK to come up with this complete research that hopefully you'll find really interesting when it comes down to how to build a brand in times of crisis.
Awesome. Thanks for that intro and setup, Michele. What we'll do is we'll just kind of kick off the presentation as we kind of lead into the beginning part of this. What we're going to be specifically sharing is some of the consumer behaviors and sentiments that have changed as a result of the things that have been going on in terms of current events. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the innovation in the face of all of this change from some brands that we were tracking as well. So as we sort of think about that, one of the first things that we really wanted to connect around is this notion that in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, one of the things that we're seeing is that consumers are seeking trusted guidance and support from brands. And not only that, but increasingly at a local and personal level.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this, Scott, there's good and there's bad that's packed in here. So as folks can see on the screen, we talk about the US, how they're looking towards retailers and brands for support. Now, what's really interesting, as I mentioned, we do a barometer every 2 weeks. These numbers are actually down. And what's interesting is support, or consumers feeling supported across all categories, actually are feeling down. But what's interesting is the rankings have stayed the same. So retail has remained the second highest in terms of support, followed by brands throughout our tracking. And what's interesting is these numbers have actually gone down about 10 to 15%. So now only 39% of those that we spoke to feel that retailers are being supportive, and 32% are feeling brands are supportive. And I just think that has a lot to do with fatigue at this point, to be honest with you, because all categories are down, including healthcare workers. So we're starting to see, I think, people feeling a little antsy, they're feeling fatigued. I think everyone is sort of waiting for things to return to normal and instead of accepting that this is the normal that we have now. And I think we're seeing that reflected in the numbers.
It's amazing. You like read my mind, because I was going to ask if that was the fatigue kind of setting in sort of the situation. I know it's kind of weighing on people a little bit. And to your point, it is interesting to see kind of like everyone just sort of waiting for the next thing to come. But it seems like we're kind of still stuck in this sort of current situation that we're in right now.
Right. And I think what's really interesting, sorry, before you go to the next slide, if you think about it, all the entities that people are looking for support, retail is coming up as number 2 for us. So I think there's a huge opportunity when you're thinking about building brand loyalty, retaining or gaining new customers, now is really the time as an opportunity for brands to really step up, specifically retail brands, in order to give that support that consumers are really craving.
And, sort of aligned with what we just spoke about, this sort of notion of consumers really expecting brands to sort of position themselves or almost humanize themselves in the context of this sort of shared experience that everyone has been going through, and really sort of leaning into that empathy as that defining theme of the way that they're kind of talking to consumers right now.
Right. And I think in any time, if you're going to start to build brand, you need to do it before a crisis hits, right? This authenticity, this empathy is really important in just brands in general. But particularly now, when we're facing a crisis, we saw that 66% of consumers think brands should be communicating messages of support while also supporting not just consumers, but frontline workers. And we did some extra digging around this as well, about whether or not people will remember those brands that are showing the support. And from what we found is 85% of the people that we surveyed across the globe said they would remember brands that are supportive during the COVID crisis. So again, if you're thinking not just today, but if you're thinking about building brand loyalty down the road, you really want to be paying attention to what consumers are feeling, what their current perception is, and how you can sort of build on their trust and retain their trust. And honestly, it has to do with how you're communicating and what you're saying. And I know you guys have some really great examples later on in the deck that we can use to sort of support this, to see what brands are doing that are really smart, or that is really smart.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think you sort of discussed something, pretty interesting there, which is like, as you were talking about this, I'm like thinking about CSR always feels like this big kind of like long-term thing, but these are like things that brands need to be doing sort of right now in terms of like actually, creating sort of meaningful change there.
Yeah, and it's not just CSR. We also took a look at things like email messages that brands are sending out. And the most liked text or lines from those email comms that people are getting are things like, I'm grateful to my employees, I'm proud of them, take care of yourself if you're a customer. So CSR is definitely one part of it. But when you're thinking through your messaging, it's being authentic and acknowledging what's going on and showing support in ways that I think really resonate with consumers.
And I think this is interesting. As sort of in line with that sort of idea of fatigue that you talked about, in the midst of everything right now, it's interesting to see how this sort of notion of wellness, both sort of mental and physical, is becoming such a sort of big component of how people are thinking about their own sort of individual lives, and what that means for brands who kind of can step in there and provide some of that support.
Yeah, this is really interesting because I think we're going to step into a tale of two cities, or really talk about the importance of segmenting messages, and that there's not going to be one size fits all for all consumers in this respect. Because what we're seeing is that 46% of the consumers are really focusing on themselves and thinking about their well-being. We even have 30% more of the people that we spoke to are exercising. So when you think about that, and I'm sure you and I probably know these people, they're coming out with what they call a quarantine bod. These are people that are buying those like things off of Instagram for exercise equipment. They're in the parks that are running, 10Ks every day. So these are people that are really focusing on themselves, not only to take care of their mental well-being, but really looking at their physical well-being as well. Really looking to take advantage of this time, whether or not they have more time, whether or not they are reevaluating their priorities, but to really focus on themselves. So this is one segment of the population that's really important to pay attention to. And we'll talk in a second about the other segment of the population, but there's definitely this group of people out there that are focusing on themselves and going to be a better version once we come out of lockdown.
Yeah, and so to that point, there is that sort of other kind of complement to that, or contrast, which is that, in the midst of all of this uncertainty, consumers are really kind of gravitating towards these things that are familiar and nostalgic, and kind of seeking comfort within the context of all of this sort of heightened stress that they're dealing with right now as well.
Yeah, and over half of the people that we surveyed are craving comfort food, right? So this is the other half of the population. Granted, it could be the person that runs a 10K and then comes home and eats Kraft macaroni and cheese. But what we have are these people that are exercising more, but then we have this other half where 42% of the people we spoke to that are exercising less and really craving comfort. So when you think about physical and mental well-being also sometimes is associated with nostalgia. What makes them feel good? And there are brands specifically that some of us grew up with in childhood, McDonald's, Betty Crocker, Campbell's, that really take care of us mentally. And it's also the flip side and the importance of when brands are thinking about how to communicate with customers or consumers, they have to make sure that they're talking to both sides, right? So if you're going to be talking about nostalgia, you want to make sure you have a positive tone to that. It's very important. That can get a little sad. But what we found is that you want to make sure that you're staying positive, but you're thinking about these people that are on the couch, eating their mac and cheese, trying to make themselves feel good, versus the people that are out running 10Ks on Instagram looking to buy that next CrossFit product because they want to be a better version of themselves.
And then, I think this is kind of underlying a lot of the things that we're just seeing more broadly as well, is, there's this sort of sense of brands that are positioned to actually experiment and innovate in the midst of all of this are, ones that consumers are ultimately sort of turning to and sort of seeing as truly sort of innovative within this space as well.
Yeah, and we start to talk to people about how can brands earn regard or loyalty, if you will, or positive attributes moving forward. And these are all not mutually exclusive. And I want to talk about the first one because I think it's really important. Close to 60% cite price incentives when they're thinking about what a brand or a retailer could do when it comes down to favoring regard. And what's really interesting about this is, one, price incentives does not always mean sale. So that's first and foremost. But I also think the second thing that's really important is the context. Over the course of us looking at trends around what people feel, and we asked them about whether or not people are concerned with their finances. And great news is that over time, since we started the barometer in February, people are less concerned today about their personal finances than they were at the beginning. But in the US, it's still close to 50%. So if we're talking about having a real conversation or having a brand be authentic, it would make sense then for someone to tie messaging around any type of price incentive that a retailer is thinking about or going to implement, because that's going to be the top thing that consumers are looking for. I think the second thing that we talk about here, and you actually mentioned it around CSR, is around brands taking positive action to support and connect with communities is going to be an important part of this. So it's not just price, but it's what are the brands, what are the retailers doing to really connect with their community, and how are they showing support for people within the pandemic. And the last part that's on this slide, or last point, which I think is so interesting, is that 52% of the people we spoke to want brands to consider new distribution models. This goes all the way back to the first thing we talked about in terms of fatigue. I think there are people that are frustrated, getting tired of not being able to find the brand that they want when they're going into the store. And the fact that people are like, come up with a new distribution model is wild. I never would have assumed that that would have been one of the things that people would even consider. But if you even look at it at a slightly broader context, we were looking at, well, what happens if people don't find the product that they want when they're at the store? We're finding that about 30% of them will try a new product, which is amazing. But roughly about the same means they're going to pay a higher price. So if we have 50% of the people concerned, if you have people concerned about your personal finances, then you get to whatever shop or retail that you're thinking of going into, and you're going to pay a higher price for something that you may not have wanted. I think that we can do better when thinking about how do we service that consumer and how do we gain loyalty there.
So as we kind of transition out of that sort of consumer-facing kind of point of view, we'll look at some of the things that we're seeing in the marketplace in terms of these, trends that brands are sort of implementing in order to kind of meet some of those needs. And so this first idea is around fact-based messaging, which I think really kind of gets into some of that trust piece that you spoke about, and even, to that level of authenticity. And we're sort of in this, unfortunate time where there's a lot of misinformation that's being sort of communicated, not only about what was happening specifically with Corona, but just in general. And so it's interesting to see a brand like Mucinex, who you wouldn't necessarily think of as being innovative, but kind of stepping in to position itself as an expert within the space, and taking the opportunity to sort of create this campaign, which is called Spread Facts, Not Fear, which is all around sort of truth in what people should believe in there. And so I think there's something interesting about that level of like expertise that a brand can sort of bring, and then as you sort of touched on earlier, this level of trust as well.
Yeah, I love this. I love this for so many reasons. One is because the elasticity of this from the brand perspective is really nice. This idea about the spread, right? When you think about Mucinex, like the spread of different types of viruses or et cetera, and how Mucinex can fight that. It's such a subtle way of still tying into the brand, yet it has such an authentic ring to it. And it goes back to just this idea that people are trusting retailers and brands at a higher rate than they are other industries or other segments of our community right now.
And then, I think this is something that, again, we've continued to sort of see. But when you see a brand that's able to kind of spin up very quickly an opportunity to support the broader community, I think it's quite interesting. So this notion of collaborative social impact, where you're not just serving a specific set of consumers, but also sort of thinking about how your product kind of exists in this bigger marketplace. In this case, this is a direct-to-consumer brand called House, and I believe actually Helena is going to be speaking on some level maybe tomorrow. But they recognize that a lot of restaurants where they're selling their product were struggling, and created an opportunity where they were able to agilely sort of use their supply chain in order to create 9 new flavors, which were all specifically designed by partner restaurants, and then allow those partners to sell those or to participate in sort of the sales and getting 100% of the profits for each of those restaurants. So I think there's like, a lot of, it's launching brand new product. It's got that sort of like sort of social good component to it. And there's a lot of interesting things happening here.
Yeah, what I love about this is the pivot that can be done so quickly. And I think this idea about being nimble is going to be something that's really important for brands moving forward. I think we all used to talk about how there's disruption in the marketplace, especially within retail with direct to consumer and online and digital, but that's been sped up into the disruption I think we felt for 2 years into something like 3 to 4 to 5 months. And this change and this pivot is so smart because they will be, according to all of the research that we've done in the insights, this type of pivot helping around social and leaning into the social impact is going to be rewarded with awareness, loyalty, not just now, but even after we get back to whatever it is that we're going to get back to in hopefully 6 or 8 months. So I think this is so smart on so many levels. And from what we've seen around brands and people saying they will remember those who have actually been supportive, this is one of the smartest moves you could think.
Awesome. And Michelle, I apologize. I put this one in here, but I want in line with this, I wanted to sort of recognize, again, like we started this piece of research in the midst of Corona, and then there's been a lot that's been happening, obviously more in, along Black Lives Matter and diversity and inclusivity and that sort of broader conversation that's happening. And I thought this was interesting from the standpoint of Sephora, and I'm sure at this point other brands have sort of hopped on, but quickly there emerged that there was this, African Americans, Black Americans represent 15% of the population in the U.S. and brands should represent that, or retailers should represent that with space on the shelves. And I thought, again, a brand like Sephora sort of stepping up and being the first kind of major brand to say, yes, we're going to dedicate 15% of our shelf space to Black-owned businesses was, extremely important. And, it's like no one wants to be first, but, then it quickly kind of can cascade from there.
I think what's important about this too is the authenticity and action, especially now in social media. That's so important. So if you don't know who you are as a brand or as a retailer, stepping out into this space can be a little scary. So it's really important to understand who you are as a brand, what values do you have, and then how do you act on those values. I thought Ben & Jerry also did like a fantastic, aggressive, and amazing response to the Black Lives Matter movement. But you want to also make sure that you're doing it because it's authentic to your brand, and then you have action. I think it was last year, especially because now we're in Pride Month. Actually, I think it was yesterday, but Pride Month just ended. And last year, Budweiser, or one of the alcohol brands, they tried to do something around Pride Month. And it basically backfired. I think they were using the different flags of the LGBTQ movement on their bottles. And, being in a vertical that has not always been inclusive, it can be very difficult to make statements. So I think when you do this, you have to just be authentic to who your brand is and then back it up with action. I think with Sephora, the fact that you use this example is so important because they were one of the first and they actually made a pledge, and this is what we're doing behind it. I think right now consumers have very little appetite for platitudes. And I think you saw some of the backlash that comes from people that either gives hearts and prayers, we stand with you, and you look at boards and it's primarily white men, et cetera, or they're not doing anything within their services. So I think this is such a great example of the authenticity and the action that's now needed, because at this point, especially now in the pandemic, people are a little bit more not fragile, but they are in a different mental state than maybe they were if it's not a pandemic. I don't think people have time for platitudes anymore, and they're paying attention, and you will hear it on social.
Yeah, and for sure. And I think that's an interesting point. Like people are paying attention, like everyone's attention is sort of laser focused right now as well. So, things like missteps are not going to go unseen ultimately. Sort of thinking more in terms of that kind of like treating your employees just as well as, your consumers in the context of this crisis. One of the things we were seeing is this sort of move towards, what we're calling frontline assistance, but really sort of putting practices in place that ensured that employees' well-being, whether it was financial or physical, was really sort of front and center in terms of how brands responded. And then, to sort of point to the example that we're highlighting here, in this case, Vori, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is a sort of wellness brand that instead of laying off its workers, saw this as an opportunity for brands to kind of step in and actually, or their company to step in and use this as a opportunity to train them during this time so that they could still be paid for learning new skills that would ultimately make them better sort of emerging out of the crisis. And I thought that was really interesting for them to sort of take that step.
And smart, because from the work that we've done we know consumers are going to favor brands that have taken steps to retain workers during this time. And I think it's because retail is such an integral part of the community, much like restaurants are, that consumers and customers are really looking to brands to take care of their employees, not just, of course, they want discounts, et cetera, but they're really looking and shedding a spotlight on how retail employees are being treated.
And then, obviously we're sort of looking at the way that, I think community was a huge component of what was happening within the context of everything that's been going on. And the brands that already had a strong community in place were much better able to sort of pivot in order to, sort of leverage that community in different ways. And one of those was recognizing that for a large number of consumers, everything from high school graduations to weddings to birthdays were, interrupted as a result of this. And so seeing themselves as a platform where they could also, create experiences for consumers in interesting ways. So, in this case, obviously Teen Vogue is one of many brands or that sort of saw this as an opportunity to sort of bring their community closer in. And in this case, sort of leveraging their input with celebrities to create a special virtual prom for people.
Yeah, I think treating your customers like people is what this is an example of leaning into that authenticity. And I love it for a lot of ways, partly because of the company I work for. I'm really interested in connecting brands and consumers. And that's essentially what the companies did here, which is so fantastic. And I think this is part of the goodwill and the reason why people are looking to retail for support during this time is because of an example like what you just showed here for the virtual prom.
Okay. Oops. And then again, we talked about wellness, and I think there is not just sort of celebrating the things that are great and positive that are happening, but also being there as being a voice that can help consumers during this time, both in terms of that sort of mental health and well-being, and really again sort of leveraging these platforms to kind of connect people together in interesting ways. And so in this case, two consumer health brands, Hims and Hers, which, are primarily sort of looking at sexual wellness as well as, sort of hair loss and things like that, saw themselves as a way to, push forward an initiative they were already thinking, which was bringing forth the ability for consumers to connect together and sort of have these moments for mental well-being, as well as sort of eliminating stress and things like that as well.
Yeah, and this goes back to the fact that 48% are taking care of their mental, physical health, with 15% are prioritizing their mental health. So this is really speaking to that population of those that are looking to take better care of themselves and prioritizing their health and well-being. I really think this is a great example of using that.
All right, we will wrap up, and we've got, I think, one more slide. And then just the sort of, again, in the midst of everything, people were adjusting to new situations at home where already they were dealing with the sort of blur of life and home and work and all of these things together. And so brands kind of stepping in to be, take some of that onus off. And I thought this was interesting, again, a brand that you might not sort of anticipate being innovative in this way, but Whirlpool creating this sort of like opportunity to combine education and chores into something that could be fun and engaging for children. And again, kind of like helping parents, supporting them during this time as well.
I know we have to wrap, so all I will say is surprise and delight.
Excellent. So these are sort of just some quick takeaways that we've, sort of peppered throughout, which is, number one, consumers are looking to brands as guiding forces, and are taking note of how they're reacting during crises. brands are the ones that are poised to succeed, are the ones that are looking at the relationships they have and providing empathy and support. Organizational agility and sort of omni-channel are all essential to sort of enable this to happen. Alongside of this, underneath it is sort of understanding in real time what your consumers' needs, behaviors, and attitudes are, and being able to then align that with the things that you are trying to do as a brand. So that's sort of foundational to this. And then finally, this notion of really sort of treating consumers and employees as people first and foremost. And that humanizes the brand, and then also really sort of helps you lean in to develop the solutions that are going to solve real needs. So with that, Michele, thank you so much for providing that insight. And everyone can download this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.